Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for this third episode of Women of the Bible. Today, we're going to focus on Rahab, and her story introduces a powerful shift in the series. Up until now, we've seen women navigating difficult circumstances, but Rahab's story is about choice, a choice to align with God, even when everything around her is moving the opposite direction. So, at this point in the biblical story, we've moved beyond the book of Genesis. The Israelites, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, have now become a nation. They've been enslaved in Egypt, but God delivered them through Moses. And for the past 40 years, they've been wandering in the wilderness. During that time, they've experienced the parting of the Red Sea, God providing manna from heaven, water coming from a rock, victories over other nations. These were not small events. These were the kind of events that surrounding nations heard about. And as I mentioned in the first episode, God's intention with Abraham's descendants was that they will be an example, a reflection of his power, his protection, his presence among his people. And through their journey from Egypt to the promised land, that is exactly what is being displayed. Now, at this point in the story, Moses has died. Leadership has now been passed on to Joshua, who was Moses' right-hand man, and God tasks Joshua with leading the Israelites into Canaan. The first major city they encounter is Jericho. Now, Rahab lived in Jericho. She was part of the Canaanite people, a group of nations living in the land before Israel arrived, but these were people who did not follow the God of Israel. They had their own belief systems and practices. And Rahab herself is described as a prostitute. So culturally, she is an outsider, not part of the covenant, and positioned on the margin of society. Before attacking Jericho, Josh sends 2 spies into the city to gather information. They enter the city and end up at Rahab's house. But the king of Jericho hears that spies have entered the city and sends men to find them. Rahab is now faced with a decision. She can turn them in and protect herself, or hide them and risk everything. And she chooses. She hides the spies on her roof and tells the king's men that they have already left. But what makes her decision even more significant is what led her to that choice. She says, "We've heard how the Lord dried up the Red Sea before you and what you did to the kings." Joshua 2, verses 10 through 11. Rahab had heard about these events that the Israelites experienced in the wilderness. But unlike the others in Jericho, she responded differently. Before she saw anything with her own eyes, she believed. And she made a decision based on that belief. Rahab asks the spies for one thing, for them to spare her and her family. The spies agree, but they give her a condition. She must tie a scarlet cord in her window, and everyone she wants saved must be inside her house. This moment actually echoes something earlier in the scripture during the first Passover in Egypt, when the Israelites marked their doors so that they would be spared. In both cases, there is a visible sign and a decision to trust what God has said. Now, here's how Jericho falls. The Israelites march around the city for 7 days as God had instructed. On the 7th day, they shout, and the walls of Jericho collapse. And when that happens, the city is destroyed, the walls fall, the people of Jericho are not spared. But Rahab and her family are saved because she chose alignment. Even though many had heard about God, Rahab was the only one who responded. Her story reminds us hearing is not the same as choosing, and awareness is not the same as alignment. And it also teaches us something deeper. There is an element of readiness in her story. Rahab didn't wait until the walls were falling to the side. She responded before the outcome. And in the same way, we don't always know when moments of decisions will come. So the question becomes, are we living in a way that is already aligned, or are we waiting until the last moment to respond? Now, this is where Rahab connects back to what we've been building in this series. Like Tamar and Hagar, she is outside of what we consider the ideal situation. Her life is complicated and her circumstances are not perfect, but she becomes part of something bigger. Rahab later becomes part of Israel. And just like Tamar, she is named in the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. The lineage flows like this: Tamar, Perez, Judah's line down through generations, and then we get to Rahab, who then becomes part of the same line leading to King David and eventually to Jesus. So both Tamar and Rahab play a role in preserving and continuing the covenant line. As always, I like to connect these stories to our lives today, because the same God we read about in scripture is the same God who's still at work in our lives today. And I think this message is especially relevant today. We live in a world where so much is driven by what is popular, what is trending, and what is accepted. And sometimes we stop thinking based on conviction and start moving based on comfort. And sometimes everything around us is going one direction, even when deep down we feel it should be going the other. But yet we stay quiet because we want to fit in, we want to be accepted, we don't want to stand out. So we choose what is easy. But Rahab's story shows us something different. What happens when we go the other way? When we feel that pull and we follow it, even when it feels risky, even when it feels isolating, even when it feels uncertain. The message from Rahab's story reminds us alignment with God begins with a decision. Not when everything is clear, not when everything is comfortable, but in the middle of uncertainty. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't see the outcome, but she made a choice based on what she knew about God. And that choice changed everything. So the question becomes, when everything around you is telling you one thing, but your faith is telling you another, who do you believe? God's plan is not limited by background, reputation, or circumstances. He meets people where they are, in the chaos, in the uncertainty, and the in-betweens. And when we choose to align with Him, our story can take a direction we never expected. And just like Tamar and Hagar, Rahab becomes part of a larger pattern we see through scripture, where women step into difficult situations and become part of something much bigger than themselves, because God sees them exactly where they are. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode of Women of the Bible. Next time, we'll continue this journey with a woman whose story reflects loyalty, faithfulness, and quiet strength. And as always, I love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you about Rahab's story? Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next episode.